Changing a country isn't easy, but change is inevitable. And the choices we make today will shape our country for generations to come. That's why we've published our first book from Australia Institute Press. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia, from leading thinkers such as Bob Brown, Sally McManus, Dr. Emma Shortis, and Professor Brian Schmidt. The essays are a roadmap and a reminder that the solutions exist. Australia just needs the courage to implement them. Visit australiainstitute.org.au or follow the link in the show notes to order your copy of What's the Big Idea today.
After America is made on the lands of the Kure-Wurrung, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, we acknowledge that they and their ancestors have cared for the lands, rivers and sea, and all living creatures for thousands of generations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hello, I'm Angus Blackman, and this is After America. It's only March, but school's already out across the United States. Well, not so much school as the Federal Department of Education. On March 20th, Donald Trump signed an executive order that calls for the closure of the department and to hand responsibility back to the states.
Where it belongs, and this is a very popular thing to do, but much more importantly, it's a common sense thing to do, and it's going to work. Absolutely, it's going to work. Probably the cost will be half, and the education will be maybe many, many times better.
The Constitution doesn't actually empower the president to do that. It requires congressional support. A mere detail. But the move is consistent with the administration's strategy so far. Sign an executive order, put pressure on the system, or more accurately, the individual judges, members of Congress, and bureaucrats in it, and bugger the consequences. With me today is Dr. Emma Shortis, Director of International and Security Affairs here at the Australia Institute. Hello, Dr. Emma Shortis.
Hi, Angus.
How are you?
Everything is way too much, but other than that, I'm okay. What about you?
Not too bad. And to start today, I'll get to the education stuff in a second, but Emma, I wanted to ask, have you ever sent a message to the wrong person before?
I mean, I guess I have been known to be a little bit scatterbrained and get names mixed up and things like that. Sure. Why would you ask me that?
Well, let me ask you this. Have you ever accidentally sent operational details of airstrikes in Yemen to the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic?
No, I cannot say that I have done that.
Because that appears to be what's happened.
Yeah, it does.
What?
Yeah, it's what I mean. Like we keep saying that, this story is so wild, or like, how could this even be real? But things like that keep happening, don't they? So this comes out of this story published in The Atlantic this morning at the time of recording, where the editor of The Atlantic has apparently been inadvertently added to a Signal group chat that apparently included the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, and the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, about imminent US attacks on Yemen, targeting Houthi rebels who are targeting shipping lanes. And so what's happened apparently is they've, for some strange reason, accidentally added this journalist who, understandably thought it was a phishing operation, or that it might be foreign agents or whatever trying to capture him or compromise him. But he stayed in the group chat for obvious reasons. And, he's published this piece kind of detailing his experience and, how he came to realize that it was probably real. And he did that at first by kind of noting that the person who was identified as the Vice President, J.D. Vance, was saying things that J.D. Vance would say about, for example, hating the idea of bailing out Europe again, that this should be a European problem, and he hated the idea of rescuing them, which is a very J.D. Vance thing to say.
Yeah.
And so this editor of The Atlantic is like, okay, maybe this is a really sophisticated AI chatbot or something that's being used to trap me. And then he became increasingly convinced that it wasn't that, and that it was actually real, because then information was posted into this group chat that detailed operational plans, targets, and timings. And he described sitting in his car in a supermarket car park, reading what time this was going to happen, and then searching Yemen on Twitter and seeing that bombs were being dropped on Yemen at the same time. So this confirmed to him that this was real. And eventually, the information posted in that group chat became so compromising and should not have been posted in a Signal group chat that the editor himself exited the conversation. Like he removed himself from the group chat, which would have sent a notification to said group chat, which still apparently didn't respond until the editor actually contacted officials to be like, hey, I was added to this group chat. I'm just wanting to see, like, is it real? Did they mean to do it? So yeah, it's this incredibly wild, like for this information to be posted in Signal, to have a journalist
Which is, for
added.
listeners who don't know, like a regular, it's an encrypted messaging app,
Yeah.
but it's not as secure as proper government systems where you go into a room or
exactly.
leave your phone outside. Yeah.
So it's an app that's trusted by journalists. It's one of the more trusted encrypted apps, but he's certainly not allowed to use it for classified information. And certainly this kind of information, exactly as you said, cabinet level officials should be going into secure rooms and not having their phones with them, because while the app itself might be encrypted and relatively safe, phones aren't necessarily.
No.
Phones can be compromised, phones can be lost. So the risk level of this kind of information being available and posted in this way is pretty significant.
You're talking about a deceitful and highly discredited so-called journalist who's made a profession of peddling hoaxes time and time again.
We have an amazing group. Our national security now is stronger than it's ever been. There was no classified information, as I understand it.
Nobody was texting war plans, and that's all I have to say about that.
Right,
Thank you. I appreciate it.
That's
The
it.
NSC said it was authentic.
The specific time of a future attack, specific targets, including human targets. He can say that it wasn't a war plan, but it was a minute by minute accounting of what was about to happen.
It's completely ridiculous, but it's also really serious, right? Like about 50 Yemenis are reported to have died in this strike. The suggestion is, as you've said, that there's a bunch of information that the journalist was privy to that could have, if they had not acted responsibly, completely compromised US, who knows, maybe other assets in the Middle East.
Yep.
Like how serious could the consequences of this sort of thing be?
Look, I mean, theoretically, they're really serious. I mean, they're already serious, as you've just outlined. But, if it's a different journalist, a different person, this particular journalist, for example, didn't publish the names of everyone mentioned in the chat. There was a CIA agent, for example, who was named in the chat, and he didn't publish their name for security reasons. But of course, somebody else may not have behaved that way. The information itself could have been compromised. I think there is real concern about not just this information, but about the cavalier way in which that kind of information is being treated. And I think that it really adds to the sense, particularly among the United States' traditional allies, that the Trump administration can't necessarily be trusted in the way that previous administrations have been trusted with this kind of information, and that speaks to concerns in, for example, the Five Eyes group that Australia is part of, the intelligence sharing network, which has pretty big concerns about Russian access to that intelligence, for example. So this kind of adds to that weight of evidence about how cavalier the Trump administration is with this kind of information. I think it's worth saying as well, and we've talked about this before, that the kind of secrecy around, quote unquote, national security issues is often really actively anti-democratic. And so I think it's important not to fall into the trap of, talking about national security in a really hawkish way that assumes all of this information always has to be secret, which is not to underestimate the risk involved with immediately sharing classified information. But it is one of those kind of internal ideological contradictions, I guess, of the Trump administration as well.
Yeah, wild stuff. So moving on to some more wildness, the Federal Department of Education. So Trump signed an executive order calling for it to be ended. But this isn't a new idea, right, Emma?
No, so this is a really old idea. There have been calls to dismantle or end the federal Department of Education for decades, if not longer. There was actually a call to do this in the very first mandate for leadership that the Heritage Foundation published in 1981. So it was kind of a big feature of Reagan administration kind of ideology and not quite policy, but, this is a long-standing aim, I guess, of the broad conservative coalition in the United States, which actually extends back to the civil rights movement in the United States and effectively the white backlash to the desegregation of schools in the United States. So the response of the conservative movement and I guess kind of white supremacists in the United States was to call for the dismantling of the federal Department of Education because it was the federal government that was enforcing school desegregation. And so the idea was that you give that control back to the states, so it becomes a states' rights argument, which would allow Republican states or conservative states in particular to resegregate schools or to enforce policies of what they call as school choice or parent choice or parental empowerment sometimes, which are all terms that have shown up in this executive order that Trump just signed a few days ago.
So who would be most affected by this closure if it were to happen?
Yeah, so I think this speaks to a general, I'm not sure if misunderstanding is the right word, but an idea of what the federal Department of Education does. There's this idea that it kind of controls everything and funds everything, but actually it doesn't really. Like a lot of education funding is already with the states, education and curriculum as well as with the states. So what the federal department does is actually provide a lot of funding to the most vulnerable students, so kids with disabilities, for example. What that means is dismantling the federal Department of Education will affect the most vulnerable students. We'll withdraw funding from kids with disabilities, the kids who need it the most. And so there's been a lot of coverage that suggests, this is yet another example of the kind of leopards eating faces party, that I voted for them, but I didn't think the leopards would actually eat my face. I think that's uncharitable. I think that it's not necessarily that straightforward, and we can't really predict necessarily how people will react or how other systems will react, because state departments of education may step in. That may be the plan, that they will kind of rescue Trump from the worst of the political consequences. But the basic idea is that you take funding away from the most vulnerable and you allow people who aren't vulnerable, white middle class people, for example, to effectively kind of segregate schooling, which then further entrenches inequality and distrust in government, which is, a cycle that the Trump administration is seeking to entrench more broadly, not just in education, but really in everything that government does.
Yeah. So would you say this is part of the broader sort of anti-DEI trend in this administration?
Yeah, absolutely. I think especially if we see that attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion in that longer history of anti-segregationism, that it's not a new thing to attack diversity measures that the federal department might be engaged in. It's actually part of a much longer history of white backlash and this sense that certain privileges are under attack from more vulnerable groups, which Trump taps into so well. But I think that's exactly what it is an example of how Trump fits into the longer and broader history of the conservative movement in the United States, and also how it's using him, how it's seen him as an opportunity. Because I don't think Trump particularly cares about education policy or how the Department of Education runs education policy in the United States.
Or detailed constitutional arguments about states' rights. Yeah.
Yeah, we know he doesn't care about that at all, but he knows where his power comes from. And so much of what he's been doing in this first few months of the administration is rewarding the base that brought him to power, by implementing the recommendations of Project 2025, for example, and this is one of them. So, at least so far, he's been really effective at doing that.
Yeah. And so, like you say, this idea might have a long history, but the strategy is actually pretty unique to this administration. I mean, legally, Trump can't end funding unilaterally, right? Like that requires Congress. So, but is he using this to just pressure Congress? Is that the purpose?
I think that's absolutely part of it. And it's worth saying that it is unconstitutional. He can't, the president can't dismantle an agency of the federal government without congressional approval. He can dramatically undermine it, which he's already doing with the Department of Education by...
And a few others.
And yeah, exactly. by, firing a bunch of people so, it can't do the administrative work that it needs to, or by withdrawing or redirecting funding. But I think this will put pressure on Congress. I think it's unlikely that it would ever get through Congress. A Marist poll quite recently found that 63% of Americans are opposed to the dismantling of the Department of Education. So it's not a popular idea. But he's also already tried this with other federal agencies. This is what he and Musk have done with USAID. They've effectively dismantled a federal agency, which is unconstitutional. There's been some legal pushback, but not enough. Even though it's clearly illegal, USAID is dismantled effectively. Funding has been stopped, has been withdrawn. It's not engaged in any of its operations. The projects have been stalled. And that was a test run. I think, that was an easy one because of perceptions of, the US's role in the world and waste. And they're now trying it on with the Department of Education because they've been successful so far. And so, how much pushback there is from Congress is going to matter a lot. And how much pushback there is on the ground as well is going to matter a lot. But certainly, they don't care that it's unconstitutional.
No. On the pushback, Democrats have been kind of fighting internally after Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer eventually kind of waved through a Republican spending bill. What was this all about?
Yeah, so this is you're right, Angus, a kind of broader fight that's going on in the Democratic Party, which, it's worth remembering is not really a party in the sense that we in Australia might think of a party. They're not kind of locked down by party discipline or a requirement to vote altogether. So there is that kind of individual choice. But Chuck Schumer is a really senior Democrat, and it was symbolically really important that he waved through this Republican spending bill with almost no pushback. And I think there's real frustration, particularly amongst progressive Democrats and the grassroots support of the party, that there isn't more, that senior Democrats aren't fighting harder, against the Trump administration. And there have been some extraordinary reports about this. There was one exclusive report in Axios about how senior Democrats were pissed. And that was the quote, that they were pissed off that constituents were calling their office and asking that they fight back harder against the Trump administration, which is extraordinary in itself. But it's also extraordinary that that story was leaked as well by a senior Democrat, like that this is the kind of conversation that is going on internally amongst the senior leadership of the party, and a party that, it's worth mentioning, framed the whole election and their whole fight against Trump as him being a threat to democracy. And the accusation is that senior party leadership is now not acting like that is the case, even though it is so clear that that is exactly what is happening.
We will not allow America to become an oligarchy.
This isn't just about Republicans. We need a Democratic Party that fights harder for us too.
We don't want a king in the United States. We overthrew a king.
And so on, I guess, the progressive side of the Democratic Party, Senator Bernie Sanders and Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have been holding kind of really large rallies against the Trump administration. And Sanders himself said that he's getting more people to his rallies now than he was getting when he was running as to be the Democratic nominee for president. What message do you think this should be sending to the Democrats?
I mean, I think it's pretty obvious, isn't it? That there is this huge appetite in the United States, particularly amongst the base of the Democratic Party, for a bigger fight against the Trump administration and what it is doing. Sanders has been talking about this for a long time. He's been talking about the billionaire class and kleptocracy and inequality for a really long time. And all of a sudden that message, rightly, has a lot more currency. And I think, so much of the Democratic Party's base has been so worried about Trump and Trumpism for so long, and the party's been ignoring them. The base of the Democratic Party was saying that in the lead up to the election. They were crying out for more progressive policies from the Harris campaign, which effectively, ignored them. And, I think that partly explains their election loss and the inability of Democrats, the party more broadly, to respond adequately to Trump is pretty shameful and also pretty dangerous, because what Trump is doing is so dangerous, and the absence of significant pushback is allowing him space to do the things that he wants to do. with the Department of Education and elsewhere. And once he starts dismantling those systems, which are already so fragile, the weaker they get, the harder it is to rebuild. Like, this is a kind of time-limited question. And Democrats, aside from the kind of more vocal ones that you mentioned, just don't appear to be up to the task of responding.
So we've just talked about the formal kind of political establishment in the US, but there has been some grassroots pushback, particularly against Tesla, the electric vehicle company run by Elon Musk, who also runs sort of the Department of Government and Efficiency. So that pushback's happened in the United States, but also around the world. Tesla's sales have dropped reportedly by more than 70% in Australia and Germany, and the company's share price has tanked. Did Elon fuck around and find out here?
I think he absolutely did. And he appears to be very surprised at this result, which is extraordinary for somebody who kind of classifies himself as a political genius, right?
An interplanetary.
Sorry, good point. This all, it has a longer history, Of course, these kind of corporate boycotts are often used in protest movements, but you can kind of trace the real tanking of the share price to giving that Nazi salute twice at Trump's Inauguration Day rally. That's when the response came out. That's when, people started slapping stickers on Teslas. And this has kind of snowballed now to the point where, like, it's even gotten pretty French in the States where, protesters are doing things like throwing Molotov cocktails at Teslas and Tesla dealerships. Like, it's gotten really quite serious and is a reflection of, a sense of disempowerment in the United States where people feel like they don't have avenues for pushback against what Elon Musk is doing, which is incredibly dangerous and damaging both inside the United States and outside of it.
Tesla is a peaceful company. We've never done anything harmful. I've never done anything harmful. I've only done productive things. So I think we just have a deranged, there's some kind of mental illness thing going on here, because this doesn't make any sense. And I think there are larger forces at work as well. I mean, I don't know who's funding it and who's coordinating it, because this is crazy. I've never seen anything like this.
I think, one of the really concerning things is both the seriousness of what is happening, but also the seriousness of the response, because Musk is now kind of saying that this is a conspiracy against him, in the same way that Trump and his cronies kind of always do. But they're also seeing it as an opportunity to engage in further repression. So the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, for example, is calling this domestic terrorism and is suggesting that people who are charged with vandalizing Teslas in particular might face 20 years in prison. So they are using this as well as a political opportunity for more repression. And, and they keep doing this. They keep testing the waters with particular people, with particular groups, and then extending those tactics out, as we were talking about before. So as much as it is pretty funny to see Elon Musk whinging about this on Fox News, the potential consequences for people are really pretty serious.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And just on Elon, the New York Times reported that he was due to be briefed on the US government's quote-unquote war plans with China. This was denied by Trump himself, who suggested that Musk might have a conflict of interest because of his business interests in China. I mean, they've let him rip on basically every other part of the US government. Despite his very clear commercial interests, why draw the line here?
I think the first thing I would say about this is that it is a good reminder of how bad reporting on Trump can still be. It's gotten a lot better, I think, since the election campaign even. But so much of this story where, Musk was, as he said, Musk is supposed to be briefed about war plans with China, but then they decide not to because he's got a conflict of interest. So much of it was reported back in that straight way. But the idea that Trump cares about conflicts of interest at all, how could you possibly think that, if you're paying the slightest bit of attention to Trump and his politics? He clearly does not care about conflicts of interest, exactly as you said.
This is the man who's plugging his own coin on his own social media website.
Exactly. And letting a man like Musk, oversee the regulations that regulate his own businesses. Like it's wild. Like, of course they don't care about that. I think this is about, we've talked before about the kind of ideological makeup of the Trump administration and, how Trump is kind of framed and understood as anti-war, but isn't at all, and how his cabinet in particular is very hawkish, particularly on China. And so I think that's what this is. This is Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, who is incredibly hawkish on China, like existentially opposed to China, winning that ideological battle, where they see Musk as somebody who might be opposed to a war with China because of his business interests in China, specifically around Tesla. So I think that's why Musk has been, or is being locked out of that part. Again, as part of these kind of ongoing internal ego struggles between emotional men. But I guess the other thing, like the other wild thing about this, and you kind of got at this as well in the reporting, is that this was about war plans for China, and that's kind of reported as if it's just like a normal thing to talk about. And of course, the Pentagon's engaged in war planning all the time, but the way it's reported as, this was an issue about conflict of interest and not the fact that Pete Hegseth is now kind of in charge of planning for a war between China and the United States, is and should be pretty concerning.
Yeah. I mean, particularly for a country like Australia, right?
Mm-hmm.
On Australia, last week, the US pharmaceutical industry reportedly complained to the Trump administration about Australia's pharmaceutical benefits scheme, claiming it's too restrictive and that Australians don't pay enough for medicines. What are Trump's likely options here?
Well, I think if Trump is listening to the pharmaceutical industry, and, we know he does listen to American corporate interests, and often, almost always, actually, I should say, always acts on their behalf. He's got a number of options, and he usually picks the bluntest one, which is to threaten and say, if you don't do this, if you don't give me what we want, if you don't give us what we want, then we'll go after your PBS, which, of course is pretty concerning. And I think it's also worth mentioning it's part of a longer history. Like, this isn't new with the Trump administration. Big Pharma in the States went after the PBS when Australia was negotiating a free trade agreement with the United States 20 years ago, and has remembered that they were unsuccessful that time around. So I think it is pretty concerning given the way that the Trump administration is treating allies like Australia when it comes to tariffs, for example, the way it is completely disregarding free trade agreements and the international rule of law more broadly.
And this is a free trade agreement too, where, as our colleague Greg Jericho argues, John Howard, his argument is that he gave away quite a lot. Like, it's not the strongest, most in Australia's favour agreement of all time, right? And that this might not be enough is pretty worrying. I mean, particularly for an issue as important as health, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And Greg is absolutely right that the free trade agreement, we didn't really get a lot out of it and haven't historically gotten a lot out of free trade agreements generally, because particularly with the United States, there is this mindset, of course, that the Australian government has to keep giving things to the United States. We have to keep giving them what they want, sometimes even before they ask us, just in anticipation of what they might want, in order to shore up this mythical security guarantee that they give us in return. And you can see that mindset still with reporting on the alliance where, questions about these tariffs on steel and aluminium are framed as like, oh, what can we give them in so that they won't do this to us? We'll just hand over our critical minerals. We'll guarantee supply of all of our critical minerals straight to the United States so they don't do this to us. Like, that mindset is deeply ingrained. But I think what the Trump administration highlights, again, is the kind of futility of that strategy, that Trump is never satisfied. It's never enough. You can never rely on him to be satisfied or even to care. Trump doesn't care about the health of Australians or the integrity of our pharmaceutical benefit scheme. He cares about himself and corporate interests, and recognizing that and responding accordingly is pretty urgent. And I think, I should say that's why it is kind of heartening that the Prime Minister has said quite clearly that the PBS is not for sale, it's off limits. The Leader of the Opposition has said something quite similar. So there has been, I think, or you can see a potential shift underway at least in the conversation around the alliance here in Australia.
Yeah, and it's particularly interesting timing too in the lead up to an election in Australia, right, where the Labor Party seemingly is going to be using it announced a new policy with the PBS to make medicines cheaper, that's going to be kind of a part of their election campaign, that this might end up politically being something that they can push against and kind of use to their advantage even. Like, so that might explain why Albanese has gotten a little more muscular, I suppose, with his language over the US.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's, possibly partly because allies like Australia, are looking to what's happening in places like Canada, where pushback is, kind of necessary, but also politically quite popular. The Canadian Liberal Party's polling was completely tanking, and partly as a result of their response to Trump has turned around in the most remarkable fashion, to the point where the new Prime Minister feels comfortable calling an election in just a month. So I think the eye of the Australian government is, of course, on what's happening elsewhere, and also what's happening in Australia, where, we've talked about before on the show, opinion is changing about Australia's relationship with the United States and how trustworthy the Trump administration is. And the idea that, it would come after something like the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, something that benefits all Australians, is pretty worrying. And I think pushback is entirely necessary.
Emma, I think that's probably all we've got time for today. It's been fun. Thanks very much.
It's been really fun. Thanks, Angus.
If you want to read some more good gear from Dr. Emma Shortis on the Australia-America relationship, you can check out her essay, Daddy Issues, Finding Ourselves in Trump World, in the latest issue of Australian Foreign Affairs magazine. You can find it in the link in the show notes or in all good bookstores. If you're enjoying After America, please leave us a rating and review on your podcast platform of choice. It makes a big difference. This episode was recorded on Tuesday, the 25th of March, and no doubt a bunch of stuff will have changed since then. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation, and our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. We'll be back next week. I'm Angus Blackman. Thanks for listening.